Hey everybody, welcome back. Today we're going to be lecturing on biodiversity, evolution, and ecology. Well, when I say we, I actually mean Professor Bree Day, who I've asked to guest lecture. I know a lot about this stuff and I've lectured on it for years, but there's nothing quite like bringing in a superstar who really knows this stuff and asking her to lecture, and she was happy to do it. So she put together a very nice video. We're going to present that in this section here. It's going to be a part one and a part two because it's a lot of information to cover. And so I hope you enjoy it.
Hi, everyone. My name is Bree Day, and in this lecture, we are going to discuss biodiversity. What is it? Why is it important? And how did it get here? And where is it going? And what are the processes and the elements that will sustain high biodiversity on Earth? So before we get started, I just wanted to introduce you to my favorite critter on Earth. This is the star-nosed mole. And I just love him. One, he's adorable. And two, he's just a perfect example of how evolutionary forces can shape adaptations of organisms to produce truly remarkable creatures. Check this out. This guy lives in the soil. He spends most of his life underground, really doesn't get to see much light or see much of anything because he lives in the dark. And so why put your energy towards an adaptation that you don't need? Eyes, namely. So he has eyes, but he's mostly blind because he doesn't need them. And instead, he's taking that energy and putting it towards what he really does need, which is this amazing nose here. That's his nose for smelling out food and things under the soil. And check out these claws, clearly adapted for digging. And he also happens to be the world's fastest chewer. Just more coolness of this guy. So let's get started on our conversation about biodiversity. And I've put a few more examples of amazing life forms on Earth here for you to just get a potpourri sample of how diverse life on Earth really is. So life on Earth extends from things as small as bacteria, or arguably even smaller, like viruses and prions, if you think they're alive, which I do, or things as big as redwood trees and elephants. And everything in between, plants, fungi, protists, you name it. And so just check it out, and it makes the world a really interesting place to live. If everybody was the same, wouldn't be that interesting, right? So let's give a formal definition of biodiversity. So biodiversity is the variety and variability of life forms on Earth. And so if you're trying to conserve high biodiversity in areas, you're going to really look at two kinds of diversity that are required to sustain this. One is obvious, species diversity. So as you look at these pictures, you see a lot of different kinds of species. Now we could actually get into what a species is, which we will later. It's not as simple as you might think initially. But in addition to conserving the different kinds of species on the surface of what they look like, we need to look at their genetics. And so you want to make sure you're maintaining genetic diversity. We'll go into this a little bit more detail later, but genetic diversity is kind of nature's insurance policy against environmental change. And so the more genetic diversity you have in a population, the better chance that that species will survive into the future. Now, not only do we want to conserve genetic diversity and the species themselves, but we also need to conserve ecosystem diversity. So an ecosystem is the living and non-living environment that a species would be existing in. So we're talking about the habitats the species live and all the living and non-living interactions that the species has. And so that's the tricky part, in my opinion. The trickiest part is to conserve ecosystems and ecosystem processes so that we can conserve species. Now, here's the big question: why? Like, why do we care about biodiversity? Well, we already said it's more interesting, right? Imagine if you were going into a forest, would it be more interesting to have a forest full of different kinds of species and therefore different kinds of animals and other plants that the ecosystem can support? Or would you want it just to be all Christmas trees? So most of us would probably say we like a little variety in our lives. Well, also, as humans, we tend to be kind of anthropocentric. We tend to want to put our efforts towards conserving things that we derive a direct benefit from. And so we can say that high biodiversity generates ecosystem services. In other words, things that nature provides for humans that are of benefit. So many of our medicines come from nature. So for example, aspirin, you're going to get from the tropical rainforest. So much of our food obviously is dependent on high species diversity. The oxygen we breathe is produced by plants and algae. Wood that we harvest from forests is for everything, right? From the chair I'm sitting on to the paper that you write on, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So wood is very much a product of the diversity of tree species in our environment. Water, and then a lot of people don't understand that water and air purification, so getting rid of pollution that's often human caused, can be in a large part remedied through high species diversity. So for example, wetlands, with their variety of plant species, are wonderful at purifying water that goes through there. And of course, all sorts of other goods and services that we get from nature. So, and let's not forget ecosystem resilience. So in general, the higher the biodiversity, the more resilient an ecosystem will be if a disaster strikes. So for example, if a fire went through a place, or there was a big climate change episode, those ecosystems that have high biodiversity are going to spring back from that event faster than ones that didn't have high biodiversity. Those ones are more likely to see mass extinctions and get wiped out altogether, kind of the domino effect. So who in the scientific community would lead the charge towards conserving biodiversity? Well, it turns out there's a whole field of science called conservation biology. And conservation biologists are those scientists, like myself, who have to take good science and the good scientific method way of extracting information, but also somewhat putting a rush job on it. Because in so many cases, when you're talking about small populations or endangered populations, you're dealing with a time element. You don't have the time to do all of the long-term studies that you would normally do in other fields. You often have to work with government officials, the general public, and other institutions to make rapid decisions that will hopefully conserve an endangered habitat or an endangered species. And so for that reason, because we have to make quick decisions using the best science available at the time without having the long period of time to be able to go through a rigid scientific process, conservation biology is called a crisis discipline. And so conservation biologists study and conserve species and ecosystems, and we do so with the best science we can do and get hold of, but also with informed decisions that are often collaborative, that involve not just science, but things like politics and philosophy and economics and sociology and all that kind of stuff. So very interesting field and highly recommended. All right, so let's say we're all on board. We're like, okay, biodiversity is a good thing. We want to conserve it. How do we do that? So, so many fields of study out there, and religious faiths and all sorts of things tend to have a book or a set of principles that serve as the basis through which all future actions are going to stem from. And so the same thing could hold true for conservation biology. This guy right here, Aldo Leopold, recognized this. He said, if we're going to be able to truly conserve biodiversity, we need to have a land ethic, an ethic that's written down that says, this is where we start from, and anything that goes against this edict is contrary to what our goals are. So he wrote, a thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. That means the living community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. And there you go. So if it preserves it, it's good. If it doesn't, it's not good. So I mentioned that, conservation biology is a crisis discipline. We are in a rush to save biodiversity. And that's because we're seeing bigger threats and they're coming faster than ever before to biodiversity. And how does that happen? Well, I would say if I had to vote for a single thing to be the largest contributor to threats to biodiversity, I would say habitat destruction. So through all the activities that humans do, whether it's building roads and buildings, causing pollution, just rainforest or deforestation, clear cutting, all those things are habitat destruction. And when you destroy the habitat, you're going to destroy the species that live there. Because as we'll talk about later, habitats contain the resources that species depend on. And so we're losing ecosystems faster than ever before. Basically, you can lose a football field of size rainforest in just a few minutes. So in addition to habitat destruction, I'd say number 2 is probably invasive species. This is one of my areas of expertise. I studied an invasive mosquito, the Asian tiger mosquito, and how fast it can spread its range by displacing native species. And so we're seeing invasive species of all sorts all over the place. And invasives are very good at just moving in and taking over and outcompeting native species. And so you get drastic loss of native species very fast due to invasives. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit as well. Genetic pollution. So just as an example with crops, GMO seeds often blow into non-GMO areas and end up basically breeding with the non-GMO plants. And so that would be considered genetic pollution. Overexploitation. This is where poaching and hunting and fishing, just to levels that don't allow for rapid replacement of the species. So you get declines of populations because they're overexploited. Hybridization is where you might have 2 populations that are genetically distinct from one another. They have awesome characteristics that are different from one another, but often due to things like habitat destruction or invasive species, you get hybridization of 2 populations, and you essentially kill the unique genetic characteristics of the original population. In addition, you've probably heard the term climate change. So there's no doubt that the climate is changing. And usually where you hear people having some controversy is what is the principal cause of that change. But we do know climate's changing, and it's not the first time the climate's changed. It's changed for, we've been tracking it at least about 600,000 years through ice core data. So the climate does change, but the question is it changing at a more rapid pace and due, at least in part, to human activities? When the climate changes, especially when it changes very rapidly, the species that are not able to adapt fast enough will often go extinct. And given how fast climate change is happening right now, it's on a scale way faster than what the background evolutionary change rate is. And so we're really not giving species the time needed to adapt to climate change. And finally, diseases. So as we have populations of humans that are moving about all over the globe constantly, you introduce new diseases, and with the introduction of invasive species all over the world, you also, for that reason, introduce new diseases into populations. And so, again, native species that haven't had the time to adapt to that kind of change will often be wiped out. So just touching back on climate change for a minute, these are just real quickly, and I know you'll probably be going into climate change in more detail later on. But just as an overview, when you have just a little bit of change in average temperature in the world, so we're talking nothing drastic, just even a couple degrees, you can actually have big impacts on ecosystems. Again, you have changes in the climate, and the species that inhabit those areas have not had the evolutionary time to adapt to those changes. So most species have a very narrow range of tolerance for temperature. But some of the things that are predicted through climate change is not just temperature change, but precipitation change, sea level rise, changes in salinity of the oceans, and all of those things can affect organisms who have adapted to live within a very narrow range of parameters. So if the predictions are correct, we're talking about changes in health for humans and other species, changes to agriculture, and partly because of irrigation issues and temperature changes, changes to forest composition. You'll see species that could once live at a lower elevation are having to move to higher elevations, water resources, changes to coastal areas like, places where they had built apartment complexes on the beach would now be underwater. So things like that. And of course, ultimately, changes to species and natural areas. So some of the evidence that climate change is indeed occurring, just look at percent change here. This is a graph put out by NASA of rising global temperatures from 1880 till just a little bit after year 2000. And so red is the northern hemisphere and blue is the southern hemisphere. And you can see for both hemispheres, there's a trend line here, right? It's a steady increase in average global temperature, over the last 200 years or so. So, so change is happening, and it's going to have a big effect on biodiversity. So one of the implications of global climate change is that many species are going to have to change the range in which they live. So check out this example here. This is with forest composition in North America. So in green here is, some of the current areas of high forestation in the eastern and southern part of the United States. And in yellow here, so these are ranges of beech trees actually. And in yellow here, you can see under two different scenarios of climate change. So kind of a modest one and a more kind of worst case scenario one. You can see that the range of these beech tree forests are going to have to move very much north here to be able to survive the change in temperature. So there's going to be a shift of habitats of organisms to higher latitudes and higher elevations. And overall, the bottom line is a potentially very large loss of biodiversity. Okay, one of the sets of species that are going to be most highly impacted by human activities and all the things that can lead to a loss of biodiversity are endemic species. So endemic species are species that exist in one place and nowhere else in the world. So you see a lot of these guys on islands, for example. So endemic species, because they're so rare and they're so unique and they're so specialized for the habitats they can survive in, they are at some of the highest risk populations for extinction. So, for example, amphibians, you find many of these guys to be endemic in certain islands and even in certain places on the mainland. But they are very sensitive to temperature, they're very sensitive to moisture, and they're very sensitive to toxins. And so you see a very high risk for these guys for extinction. Any kind of population that has a small population is going to be at risk for extinction because they just don't have the numbers. If something goes wrong, you can wipe out that whole population. So just check out some of these beautiful endemic species here, like the Galapagos tortoise and this chameleon up there and that little frog. So very cute. So what is a mass extinction? So you're probably familiar with the dinosaurs, and you might even know that the dinosaurs went extinct during a mass extinction. It was called the Cretaceous Tertiary or KT boundary extinction. And that was about 65 million years ago and led to the extinction of the dinosaurs and so many other species, which kind of opened up the ability for mammals to kind of become the dominant species. We also saw a mass extinction called the End Permian about 250 million years ago. In the case of the KT boundary, they believe that was an asteroid that impacted the Earth. So there could be a lot of different causes of mass extinctions. And we believe that so far in the past, there's been about 5 mass extinctions. So what is a mass extinction? How is that different from just extinction? So when you're talking about a mass extinction, that means 50 to 90% of the species on the Earth are gone. Boom, really fast or all at once. But extinction in general is a normal process. So there's something called the background extinction rate. That's the natural rate at which a particular species type would go extinct over time. In general, you can expect that you're going to lose a species at least every year or so, right? Depending on the type of species. So if you look over here at the big five mass extinctions, late Ordovician, late Devonian, Permian, Jurassic, Cretaceous, and I'll just leave this little chart here for you to look at your leisure, but just showing you kind of how many species we lost at that time, what kind of species went extinct. But here's the most important point. Are we in the middle of the sixth mass extinction? It turns out we're losing species at a faster rate than we ever did before. In the case of something like the KT boundary, that was an event that led to rapid loss of extinction. But we're seeing a sustained time period now where we're losing species at 100 to 1,000 times faster than the background extinction rate. And this is going to be human caused. So due to all those things that we talked about that were threats to biodiversity, habitat destruction, invasive species, overexploitation, et cetera, et cetera. So what can we do about it? Is it just going to happen and there's nothing that we can do about it? Or are there ways that humans can alter their behaviors that could slow or eliminate the sixth mass extinction that we're in right now? Well, part of that is going to be ensuring that we sustain the ability of species to evolve. So a lot of you have heard the term evolution. Some people are like, oh, I'm not studying that. Well, a lot of the controversy that comes over the field of evolution is a lack of understanding of what evolution actually is. So basically, evolution is genetic change over time. If you see genes changing in a population over time and getting passed on, that's evolution. That's really what we mean. Now, people say, oh, well, it must be monkeys turning into humans. And that's not what it's about. And even the production of new species is one potential consequence of evolutionary change that happens over a very long period of time. But overall, evolution is the central concept in modern biology. Everything, when you're talking about biodiversity, stems from evolution. Evolution is what led to that biodiversity. Another way to look at it is descent with modification. And you've probably at least heard of this guy right here. I'm calling him Chuck here, but his name is Charles Darwin. And Charles Darwin was he was an interesting guy. He actually had studied for the monastery in the 1800s, and then ended up studying geology and went on the HMS Beagle and basically cataloged the world's biodiversity that he encountered on the trip. And through that process, he realized that you see similarities yet differences in species depending on their habitats, their behaviors, and where they're located. And so he was able to come up with the idea of evolution by natural selection as being the primary driving force of evolutionary change. Turns out at the same time, there was another guy, Alfred Russel Wallace, who independently also came up with the idea of natural selection. But he doesn't usually, you don't hear about him as often as you do Charles Darwin, because he didn't quite write it up quite as completely as Charles Darwin did. So natural selection is the primary driving force of evolution, but it's not the only process. And if you take a biology course, you can get into a lot more detail about what are these other processes that can lead to genetic change over time. But for today, we're going to focus on natural selection and adaptation. And so to do that, let's actually talk about species in general. What is a species? You kind of know a different species when you see one, or do you? So, if you suddenly saw a cow changing into a rhinoceros, that would be evidence against evolution, because that's not how evolutionary change works. It's a slow process over time. And so we can divide evolution into macroevolution versus microevolution. So microevolution would be those little changes in DNA over time. Macroevolution would be the accumulation of those things that could lead to something like a new species. But you're not going to see a cow suddenly changing into a rhinoceros. That's not how it works. Well, back to this idea of what exactly is a species. So you've probably seen a Great Dane and a Chihuahua. They're both dogs, right? But they're pretty different from one another. And you could see some logistical issues if they were to try to make a hybrid. So because those guys are probably reproductively isolated from each other, meaning they can't really easily breed and produce fertile offspring, could we consider them to be separate species? Well, it depends what you call a species. So there honestly isn't a single definition of species. Most people are familiar with what is called the biological species concept, or the BSC. And that's where a species is when you have two different populations that can not breed together to produce fertile offspring. In other words, babies that can produce babies. So if they're unable to breed, we consider them to be separate species. Whereas the PSC, the phylogenetic species concept, means, okay, maybe they can breed together and even produce fertile offspring, but maybe there's enough genetic differences between those populations that they warrant being considered separate species. Well, where do you draw the line? It's a very good question. This PSC kind of came out of the Endangered Species Act, where, scientists are trying to get funding to conserve interesting small populations. There's an example of this with two populations of squirrels on either side of the Grand Canyon. And they look different from one another, but if you were to bring them together, they could produce fertile baby squirrels. But they didn't usually breed because of that geographic barrier of the canyon there. And they looked different from each other. They had some different behaviors. And so scientists were able to successfully argue that they were genetically different enough from each other, those populations, that even though they could breed together, they normally wouldn't breed together and therefore should be eligible for funding as separate species under the Endangered Species Act. So the bottom line of all that is a species is whatever we decide to call it. Now, let's look at adaptation. So Darwin recognized that organisms have unique, interesting adaptations that seem to help them to survive and reproduce in their particular environment. And we showed you some neat adaptations of the star-nosed mole at the beginning of the lecture. But check out this guy. This is an albatross. And albatrosses are very interesting. If you see them in the air, they have these beautiful long wingspans, and they can glide for hours over the ocean looking for food without having to do much flapping. Conserves energy. And then they go in for a landing, and they're like feathers everywhere, crash. And that's because their wings are so big that they're kind of at the extreme of what kinds of organisms can fly. And so they've kind of made a trade-off between having, grace in takeoffs and landings, because even to take off, they got to kind of set themselves up a runway, and that takes a few times to get off and into the air, but then they're fine. But they've had to trade off elegant takeoffs and landings for long wings that are able them to conserve energy while they soar for food over the ocean. So adaptations are about trade-offs, specifically trade-offs of energy in the form of what we call ATP. And so there's no perfectly adapted organism. There's always trade-offs between, okay, if you're going to be well adapted for this, you're going to be less well adapted for that. So we can see examples of this, how this ATP, this energy currency, there's cost to having adaptations. So every organism has what's called an energy budget. In other words, adaptations carry costs. What's allocated for one function is taken away from other functions. So let's take an example with this guy. This is the northern cavefish. And this is a color photo. It has almost no pigment, no coloration, because it lives in dark caves. Therefore, nobody can see it. There's no mates to attract with color because the mate can't see the color. So why put your energy in towards an energetically costly adaptation like color when it would be useless? Same thing with eyesight. Just like with the star-nosed mole, this guy lives in the dark. He can't see. So why put ATP towards creating eyesight and eyes when you could put it towards something that would be helpful? So in this case, maybe a better sense of smell or an electric current that would help you find your mates and your food. And so in fact, this guy just has little holes, kind of sockets where eyes would be. He doesn't actually have eyes, and he has no pigmentation. So very well adapted to life in the cave. So, how did Darwin actually define natural selection? So, we know that he realized that different organisms are adapted to different lifestyles and different habitats. And so he summed it up like this. He said, individuals that possess a trait that improves their survival, or more importantly, their reproduction, will be more likely to pass that trait on to the next generation. In other words, if you have a population of individuals and some have a trait that allows them to leave more offspring than the next guy, than their neighbor, and therefore their genes are more represented than the next guy in the next generation, you'll see that trait continue to spread through the population over time. So that's natural selection. So we can give a good example of this with the peppered moth story. So if you look very closely at this picture right here, how many moths do you see? Well, if you looked quickly, you'd probably say one, the dark one here. But if you look closely, there's actually also a gray colored moth, or what we call a peppered moth, right next to it. And they are sitting on the bark of a tree that's covered with a certain kind of lichen, which is like a mix of algae and fungi. And so these are called peppered moths, and they come in two forms. So same species, two different morphologies, two different sets of traits, one dark, one light. And, back in the day, 1700s, 1800s, people loved to go and just catalog biodiversity. And so a lot of people would go and they would count these peppered moths and try to determine how many were gray and how many were dark colored. And what they'd find is that usually most of the moths in the population were the peppered variety, the gray kind, because they camouflaged very well, as you can see, against the birch trees that were covered with lichen. Whereas the dark form, also called the Carboniferous form, stood out like a sore thumb. So bird predators that are flying through would just pick the first thing they could see, and obviously they're going to see the dark kind before the light kind. So because the dark ones were getting eaten, they didn't grow up to reproduce and pass on the genes for being dark, and so you see the light population maintaining a high population of the whole. And this was all before the Industrial Revolution in England. Then the Industrial Revolution happened, towards the end of the 1700s, and factories went up and lots of pollution, air pollution was being produced. And that air pollution, the soot, would darken the trees and kill the lichen, which are very sensitive to air pollution. And all of a sudden, when you have dark trees, who stands out like a sore thumb now? The gray ones, right? The peppered moths. And the Carboniferous form, the dark form, were suddenly camouflaged against the background. And so scientists and just naturalists were cataloging all this and noticed very quickly everything shifted, and you found that the dark form was the common one in the population and the light form became very rare. So this was all cataloged and seemed to be good evidence for evolution by natural selection happening in a human lifetime. Well, just to reinforce that idea, the pollution had gotten so out of control in England that by 1965, the government instituted very strict regulations for air pollutants. And so as a result, we started to see pollutants like sulfur dioxide decline. And they're like, oh boy, let's see what's going on with the moths. And so you can see from this graph, this is the percent of the dark form, the Carboniferous form, going up from to almost 100%, 95%. And down here is the year that occurred in the 1900s. And so you can see here where almost the entire population was dark due to the previous happenings with the Industrial Revolution. And once that air was getting cleaned up due to the new regulation, boom, 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 by about 1989, the dark form had almost completely disappeared, and we were back to having a population of peppered moths that were actually peppered. So again, more great examples of natural selection. Because what was the selecting force here? Do a little brainstorming. What do we mean by a selecting force? So a selecting force is the thing that does the selecting, that does the natural selection. So in other words, what is causing the change in gene frequencies over time in the population? Well, if you said the birds, you are correct. The birds were, even though they're not doing it consciously, the birds were the ones choosing which colored moth would be more represented the next generation, i.e. the ones they did not eat. So just one more example of the amazing adaptations that natural selection and other evolutionary processes can produce. Check this out. So look at these guys. So there are your peppered moths. And then this guy and this guy are caterpillars that happen to very well mimic bird poop. Yes, indeed. So birds don't like to eat their own poop. And if you look like bird poop, maybe the bird predators will avoid you. So through natural selection, through evolutionary processes, populations of these particular caterpillar species became more and more similar looking to what bird poop looked like, because the ones that looked a little bit more like bird poop would be left alone by the birds and therefore grew up to breed and have little poop looking babies. The other one, this is a praying mantis insect that you can see is very well mimicking the brown leaves that are in the background. And here, this little guy right here, and there's his antenna, this is a species of katydid that is super well matched to the green leaves in the background. So be thinking about, how did natural selection lead to these amazing adaptations? And you can see this for individual species, but now put this on a larger macroscopic or macroevolutionary scale, and you realize evolutionary theory means that all these little microevolutionary processes that produce poop caterpillars and different colored moths are the same processes that are responsible for the whole diversification of life over the past 3.5 billion years. Now, keep in mind, not everything you see is a result of a lineage of evolutionary change. Sometimes you can have two species that have similar adaptations, but by coincidence, not by common descent. So we call this convergent evolution. So convergent evolution is where unrelated species acquire similar traits just because they live in similar situations, similar environments, and that kind of trait happens to give them an advantage. So an example of this would be like a bat has wings and a bird has wings, and they both can fly. But a bat is a mammal, a bird is a bird, descended from dinosaurs with feathers. So these guys are not closely related. And so the evolution of the wings in a bat came on a completely different trajectory in time than the evolution of wings in the bird. So that the evolution of wings, or the adaptation of wings and flight, in this case would be through convergent evolution, not through descent. So we're going to talk about 3 ways that natural selection can actually happen. We're going to talk about what's called directional selection, stabilizing selection, and disruptive selection. So directional selection is where there's selection for one extreme of adaptations or another. So one set of traits or another. We call these set of traits the phenotype. So one extreme phenotype or the other. And I'll give you an example of how this works and you'll understand it. Stabilizing selection is where it's not good to be either of the extremes. It's good to be average, and that gets selected for. And disruptive is where both extremes are good, but the middle is bad, the average is bad, and so you get selection for both extremes. And over time, that's usually what leads to things like speciation. So let's see how directional selection works. Imagine this on the x-axis here is the phenotype, the trait. So for example, maybe it's size. You're looking at dogs and you have small dogs over here and very big dogs like Great Danes on the other extreme. And this is the frequency of how much that phenotype occurs in the population. So, for example, maybe you could see here the frequency of small dogs is very small. If you had a litter of puppies, very few would be the runt. Over here, you have the extreme size of being large. So the biggest puppies in the litter. And you see that the frequency of that is very low as well. And in the population, or in the litter in this case, most puppies are average sized, right? They fall within a certain range. That's average. And so you see the highest frequency like that. Well, let's say there is an advantage to being large. Maybe the largest puppies were the ones that had the greatest chance of survival and reproduction. Well, in that case, we are going to select for the large extreme and select against the average and the small sizes here. And so over time, that graph is going to shift because you're going to see mortality or lack of reproduction in the small guys, and everybody who's large gets to reproduce. So in the next generation, the largest of the next generation is larger than the largest the previous generation, and the average size is more like the extreme of the previous generation. And then you do it again the next generation, and so you can pretty rapidly over time direct natural selection, or in the case of puppies, artificial selection, towards one extreme versus the other. So the peppered moths were an example of this, where they were selecting for one extreme of coloration or another. Pink salmon are another example of this. So these guys are highly fished in the Pacific Northwest, and we've been noticing over time, genetically, the size of these guys has been getting smaller and smaller. They're getting smaller. They've lost about 33% of the weight of what they had, way before 1950. And all this happened in the span of 20 years of fishing. A little over 20 years of fishing, they suddenly saw this 33% decrease in salmon weight. And it turns out that was the fault of the fishermen, because what they were doing is using nets to capture these salmon. And the holes in the nets were such that the smaller fish were able to escape through the net and live another day to breed and pass on the genes for being small. And the big ones were caught. And so basically the fishermen were artificially selecting for small fish to be the successful ones and to breed. And so therefore they were able to get this decrease in weight because they took out the gene pool for large fish. So artificial selection means it's like natural selection, same kind of process, except on a much faster scale, and it's done by humans. So for example, how did we get all this amazing diversity of breeds of dogs? We know dogs were domesticated from wolves originally only about 14,000 years ago. And so in about 14,000 years or less, we were able to get this amazing diversity of dogs, from Old English sheepdogs down to Chihuahuas, right? Well, it's through directional selection. If you want Chihuahuas, you're going to breed the guys down here. If you want Great Danes, you're going to breed the ones up there. And so if you breed these guys, next generation, the graph shifts that way to the left, and you get smaller and smaller dogs. And if you want Great Danes, you breed the largest ones. And as we said, the graph shifts and shifts and shifts. So again, stabilizing selection, it's not like directional selection. It means it's bad to be big, bad to be small in this example. And so over time, you're going to get mortality at the large extreme and the small extreme. And so the graph is going to squeeze over time so that most individuals fall at about average size. We see this with human babies. So we know that babies that have really high birth weights and babies that have really low birth weights have higher infant mortality. And so therefore they fail to grow up and have other babies and pass on their genes for size. And so most human babies follow within a pretty narrow range of birth weight. So most babies are average size. It might be around, 7 pounds, 8 ounces, something like that. Another example of stabilizing selection in nature is with this gall-making fly. So there's a fly called the gall-making fly, and he inhabits goldenrod. And when he inhabits goldenrod, he helps to trigger the production of a gall by the plant. So the gall gets there, the gall-making fly bores into the gall, and he's a tasty little grub. We're talking about the larva of this guy. And so meet the next player in this scenario. This is a parasitic wasp. And it turns out the parasitic wasp is able to penetrate small galls on goldenrods and get in there and lay its egg on the gall-making fly larva. And then that fly larva will grow up into a fly and basically become food for the wasp larva. So that's what parasitic wasps do. It's kind of evil. So they can penetrate, those wasps can penetrate small flies or small wasps to get to the small flies. Whereas if it's a large fly, it will produce a large gall on the goldenrod, and then birds are able to peck at it and get the larva. And so you see most gall-making flies in the population are average size because they're not vulnerable to the birds and they're not vulnerable to the parasitic wasps. So selection favors intermediate sized flies, and that's stabilizing selection. And last but not least, let's talk about disruptive selection. So disruptive selection is kind of the opposite of stabilizing. It's where it's good to be both extremes. So in our example, size, good to be small and good to be large. And so you see the mortality or the lack of reproduction among those that are more average size. So over time, the graph is going to look like a double humped camel. And so you see that there's an average on this side and an average on this side. And so if you continue this long enough, you continue this selective trend against the intermediate, over time, you're going to start to see those two extremes diverge further and further away from each other. And if this continues long enough, maybe millions of years, maybe if you were to bring individuals from both sides back together, they wouldn't recognize each other as the same species or physically couldn't breed together and to produce fertile offspring. And then that's how you get speciation. So an example of this, the black-bellied seed cracker from Cameroon is this bird here. And some of the individuals in the population have large beaks and some have small beaks. And there's an advantage to being large because you can crack large, hard seeds. And if you have a small beak, you can crack the soft seeds. But if you have an intermediate-sized beak, you get outcompeted by both the large and the small beaks for seeds. You're not really good at anything. And so you might fail to reproduce or leave less offspring than the other guys. And so you see over time a divergence in beak size. So you can see on a graph that disruptive selection curve. So how do we get evolution in the first place? Well, you have to have ultimately some kind of mutation in the DNA, in the genetics that will allow natural selection to act. So we call these genetic mutations. And really what they are oopses. They're errors in the copying of DNA. So if you take a biology class, you'll get into details about what the structure of DNA is. But basically, you get the wrong chemical base there. And that could give you a different trait. And if it does, it could be detrimental to the species and wipe the species out. It might be neutral and just have no effect. But in some cases, maybe that mutation causes a trait to occur that is more beneficial for that particular environment and time. And so if that's the case, that trait will be passed on through natural selection and other evolutionary forces. And so that's how you get evolution by natural selection. So ultimately, there had to have been a mutation to introduce that new genetic variability into the population. Now, mutation is a rare event. Pretty much any one gene is going to have a very, very small chance each generation of experiencing a mutation. But given an evolutionary timescale, it's bound to happen for all genes. So another way you can get new species arising is through something called parapatric speciation. Para means near, patric refers to the land. And so this is speciation that's produced through a narrowing or shrinking hybrid zone. So one example of this is with the Bullock's Oriole, which you can see here, and the Baltimore Oriole. I'm from Maryland, so I prefer the Baltimore Oriole, like the baseball team. Well, anyway, you can see the Baltimore Orioles on the East Coast and the eastern half of the Midwest. The Bullock's is on the west side. And so these guys were considered the same species. They recognized each other as the same species. And so they used to hybridize all the time. Well, birders are constantly out there keeping track of every bird that they can find. And so they noticed over a very short period of time that the hybridization between these two varieties was shrinking. Like it wasn't occurring nearly at the rate that it used to. So for whatever reason, these guys stopped recognizing each other as the same species as frequently as they used to. So we started seeing a shrinking hybrid zone in the Midwest where their habitats overlapped. And because they really stopped breeding with each other altogether, In other words, the Bullocks wanted to breed only with Bullocks, and the Baltimore wanted to breed only with Baltimore. In 1997, the American Ornithologists Union went ahead and elevated these guys from the subspecies level to the species level. And so they're now considered separate species. Species is whatever we decide to call it, right? And then the other way you can get speciation, and I'd say this is probably the more common way, is what's called allopatric speciation. And this is speciation that results from isolation from each other. So reproductive isolation, geographic isolation. So for example, you see this on island archipelagos all the time. Like in Hawaii, for example, I used to live there. I used to see this guy. He's so cute. And this is a honey creeper. And you notice his beak here, the shape of it makes him really well adapted to digging into flowers that have, like red flowers that have long little trumpets to them to get to the nectar. And so what you find is on different islands within the Hawaiian archipelago, you'll see different looking birds with different looking beaks, and that specialize in different things. So some of them have beaks for crushing seeds, kind of like we saw with those birds in Cameroon. Some are very good at picking insects out of crevices. Some have more kind of crushing things, and some are good at flowers. And so basically you had an original variety that had inhabited one island, maybe it was the Big Island, and then some others went from that big island onto another island and faced a new set of challenges, new habitats, new food availability, and some of those went to another island and faced yet another set of different environmental challenges. And over time, you see natural selection leading to adaptations specific to the particular island that species is on. And so very rapidly, you can see a variety evolving away from a common ancestor. So scientists like to give a visual demonstration of the relatedness among different species using what are called phylogenetic trees. So it's an evolutionary tree. In the old days, they were generated by looking at different species and trying to figure out, who looks most like the other, and putting them on a tree based on that, or maybe due to their behaviors, etc. Nowadays, they pretty much have scrapped that and go completely with genetics. Molecular genetics allows us to look at the DNA of species directly to determine their evolutionary relatedness. And so these are some phylogenetic trees actually generated from some of my biology students. And what you'll find is that a phylogenetic tree has different branches. So the common ancestor that would have given rise to all the species on the tree is somewhere back here. And then in this case, if you just look at this example, you can see that evolution led to two different lineages. This lineage right here and this lineage down here. And so if we go to the next branch, you can see that also branched off into two lineages. One led to primates. So you can see a gorilla very closely related here to Homo sapiens, the humans, which in this case is the Tiger King. And over here, a different branch led to the lineage for things like lemurs. And then on this branch here, so these guys would have shared a common ancestor right here, but you had this branch leading to rodents, like a gopher and a mouse. And then way over here, more distantly related, is a lineage that led to, maybe sharks and whales and things like that. Or sorry, no, these are all whales. So sperm whale, beluga whale, etc. So it's very interesting. You can kind of just see how you can get a quick visual of the evolutionary relatedness and the common ancestry of traits using a phylogenetic tree. So phylogenetic trees show evolutionary relationships among species. So many species on Earth, right? So much biodiversity, anywhere from 10 to 300 million species on Earth and more, and who knows, right? How in the world do we make sense of all this? Well, humans love to categorize things. We love to put things in different boxes. And so we can first take all life on Earth and categorize it into three different domains of life. So 3 domains. So we have eukarya, or eukaryota, it's also called. This would include us, would include the star-nosed mole, would include plants and mushrooms, anything that is has cells that have little organelles to them. So organelles would be things like a nucleus and a Golgi apparatus and all these little parts that do different functions. So that's sort of one domain. We have the bacteria. They get their own domain. So you pretty much know what bacteria are. You have everything from E. coli that live in your gut to Streptococcus that causes strep to who knows, right? There's just millions of kinds of bacteria out there. And finally, another domain called archaea. And so these guys are their own thing. They're single-celled just like bacteria are. They don't have organelles just like bacteria, but they have a different evolutionary heritage than the bacteria do, and they tend to be extremophiles. In other words, they love extreme environments, like the halophiles love salty environments, and the thermophiles love really hot environments like the thermal vents. So these are the three domains of life. And that's not good enough. We got to break that down even further to be able to get to individual species. So Linnaeus was a naturalist that came up with the Linnaean classification system called binomial nomenclature. And this allows us to take broad organisms that share broad characteristics. So for example, all eukaryotes like us and plants fit in the same category, even though we don't look much like a plant, but we share many characteristics at the cellular level with them. And break each category down further. So here is the Linnaean classification system. We just went over domain. So domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Say that 5 times fast. Domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. So just looking, for example, at the classification of a roly-poly here. Obviously, domain, Eukarya. Kingdom, Animalia, because they're animals just like we are, so we'd be in the same kingdom as them. Phylum, Arthropoda. They're arthropods, just like insects, crabs, lobsters, shrimp, spiders. They're all arthropods. We are not. We are in phylum Chordata, meaning that we have backbones. Class for these guys is Malacostraca. Ours would be Mammalia, because we're mammals. Order for these guys, Isopoda. They're isopods. Our order is Primates. We're primates. Family for these guys, how do I even say that? Armadillidae. Well, that's a mouthful. Our family would be Hominidae. We're hominids. We're the only living hominids that we know of, except maybe Bigfoot. All the other hominids like Homo erectus, Homo habilis, Australopithecus have gone extinct. And for these guys, genus, here we go again, Armadillidae. You can read it there. Armadillidium. Our genus is Homo, and then their species, Nisatum. Ours would be Sapiens. So when you actually write the species name using binomial nomenclature, you put the genus name and the species name together. So you always capitalize the genus part and lowercase the species part and put the whole thing either in italics or underlined. So I'm not going to try to read the species name of this guy again, because that armadillo just gets me all tongue-tied. But for a human, our species name would be Homo sapiens. So we would capitalize Homo, lowercase sapiens, and underline the whole thing or italicize it. So how in the world can you remember domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species? Well, you could memorize it, or you could use a mnemonic device, which is always fun. Dumb King Philip came over from Germany, slap happy. So the first letter of each of these stands for the different classification words. So the fossil record is what lets us get some insight into the evolutionary history of life on Earth. And the fossil record is so vast, you're probably familiar with what a fossil is, but basically it's an organism that had died, and maybe it was covered in something like soil, and there's pressure, and then more layers and more layers and more pressure, and eventually over millions of years you get fossils. So it's really, the fossil record is our evolutionary history of creatures, and they're embedded in rock or some kind of soil. So we see here a fossil of trilobites, nautilus, here's a fish, Archaeopteryx, which was the flying dinosaur. So this is just a tiniest sample of the amazing fossils that are out there. But when you study the entire fossil record, what it shows is that Life has been around for a long time, about 3.5 billion years, and not all the life that was around millions or billions of years ago is around today. And in fact, more species have died than gone extinct than exist right now by far. So most of life has gone extinct. And there's been 5 past extinctions, mass extinctions, as we mentioned, which have given rise to a lot of the fossil record that we see. A lot of the fossils we see were artifacts of those mass extinctions. So we're going to stop right here. What's up next is going to be just an overview of ecology and sort of the context of how that relates to biodiversity and conserving biodiversity. So I hope you enjoyed this, and see you next time.